Hi, this is a special report from Hollie McKay today, and it concerns the withdrawal of Muqtada al Sadr and his coalition from the Iraqi government. Hollie, tell us a little bit more about this man.
Well, this is actually a really important step. So on Monday, Iraq's influential Shia leader and Firebrand cleric, Muqtada al Sadr, announced in a tweet of all things that he was retiring from politics for good and he was closing all political offices and institutions. And so, just to give you a little bit of context, this move comes 11 months, almost 11 months after Sadr's party, which is the Sadrist bloc, won the majority of parliamentary elections, but it wasn't quite enough to obtain a majority government. So for the past 11 months, Iraq has really been stuck in this stalemate and inability to form a government. And that is in large part because Sadr has sort of refused to really accommodate or have these talks with the Shia political parties that are his rivals, which are predominantly backed by Iran. And so over the years, Sadr has really become this voice for nationalist rhetoric. He has very, very much stood against the Iranian meddling in Iraq, and on the same accord, has very much stood against any involvement of the US. And his Mahdi army back after the invasion of Iraq by the US was one of the really key forces in killing a lot of American soldiers. So he definitely has a lot of blood on his hands in that respect. But it's a big deal because, this could lead to huge violence in Iraq. We're already seeing Sadrist supporters. They flooded the green zone this morning. They pulled down the concrete barriers, and it caused the parliament to stop. So those institutions are currently suspended, and a curfew is being put in place in Baghdad. And there are real, genuine concerns that this could escalate into something much more.
Yeah. So just reviewing the bidding on al Sadr, he is clearly probably the most flattering description of him is that he's a true Iraqi independence kind of guy. I mean, he's resisted basically anybody from the outside that's ever tried to come into his country was his blood and mortal enemy. The United States, the Iranians, it doesn't really matter. He just doesn't want anybody meddling in Iraq's affairs. With his party departing from the political scene, and I think a lot of his members resigned from parliament as part of protesting some of this, that leaves the door open to outside influence, not from the US, but from Iran, beginning to make more inroads into the Iraqi government. What will that do to the stability of Iraq as it sits right now?
Yeah, it is concerning, and we look at it. And I spoke to a former CIA official who'd worked a lot in the Middle East this morning on this issue, and he basically said the US no longer has any leverage in Iraq. We really have pretty much kind of wiped our hands of that. We do have an embassy, but that that influence is very much waned. But mind you, that this whole debacle in Iraq, this was the US gave birth to this debacle. This was the system that we put in place after Saddam was ousted. And just to kind of go back a little bit, this is a position that Sadr has evolved into. I mean, he grew up, his father was incredibly influential Ayatollah Sayed, and their family originally comes from Lebanon. So there are questions of Hezbollah ties going back to that. But his father was very close with the Iranians. And that was how Sadr kind of grew up. Was they were the enemy of the state. They were enemy of Saddam, and so they sort of, the Shia communities there really banded together. And so now it's interesting to see how that has sort of dissipated. And Sadr has been this very lone voice, I guess, in standing against the Iranian meddling. But now with him claiming to step back, and mind you, a lot of Iraqis also view this with skepticism, because this isn't the first time Sadr has claimed that he's going to retire or step back from politics. This has happened before, and it usually turns into some sort of political ploy. So there is skepticism that in saying, I'm going to leave, you see that his loyalists really take to the streets. You see that sort of violence. And when that gets to a certain level, the question is, will Sadr then come back? Will Sadr use the violence to gain his own leverage? Essentially, what he wants is for the parliament to be dissolved. And he hasn't been able to achieve that, and he hasn't been able to call for re-elections. So in really pushing this, Sadr may be playing a complete game of bluff where he's just trying to have those re-elections and hope to get the majority that he's looking for, that he can really secure that kind of influence without Iran. But on the flip side, it is a gamble, because I think in many ways Saddam might have underestimated just the extent of the Iranian support and the extent of the influence that Iran has in its many other blocs in parliament. And it could end up, as another Iraqi friend said to me this morning, it could end up this sort of internal Shia on Shia war inside Iraq. So there's so many factors at play, but it really is something to watch.
Yeah. So, on a broader scale, if al Sadr's coalition, which is still very strong, fails to secure whatever political tactic advantage that are probably trying to get out of this, and I kind of share the view that this is a means to another end. But if it fails, and the forces that are in parliament now, which are very, very much aligned with Iran, come to fore, doesn't that change essentially the pathway of where the northern portion of the Middle East, essentially stretching the northern half of the Fertile Crescent, becomes Iranian territory, all the way out to essentially Syria and maybe all the way out to Lebanon? So should that cause any concern in the West as far as
I think that
veil of what
already
people have been
does.
working on?
That already does, that already is a big factor for the West, and particularly for the United States, is the concern of Iran and its very clear efforts to create a lot of hegemony in the Middle East. And it already has a huge control over Lebanon, has a huge footprint in Yemen, Syria, and Iraq is just is part of that crescent. And so it certainly could have much broader implications, for the US and the West, if Iran is successful in its bid to gain even more sort of control in Iraq there. So it's challenging, because you're looking at Sadr as this figure who has killed many Americans, and he is politically savvy, but he doesn't have the most scruples in the world. He took money from Iran for a very long time. It really wasn't until the last 4 years that he has kind of spoken out against them quite vehemently. So you can sort of question a little bit of, Sadr is going to do what's best for Sadr type thing. But it should be, a prominent cause for concern, because I think without Sadr, what is the bulwark against Iran? I don't know that there is one. But he does have millions of followers, and they tend to come from very impoverished communities. And as evidence today, they're certainly willing to take violent action in order to support him and get what they want.
Yeah, well, so it's a peasant war essentially against an outside empire, essentially, which is what Iran is trying to be. Yeah.
Yeah, and you have to look at you have to look at the situation in Iraq. We have to look at the implications of what the invasion was. We have to look at the sort of political infrastructure that the CPA put in place in 2005. And I hope that we can sort of take lessons from that. And then the Iraqi people in many cases have an absolute right to be incredibly angry at their government. Not only is it incompetent and not able to sort of form any cohesive unity, but especially in the South, this is a country that in the first half of 2022 took in $60 billion in revenue of oil. That's unprecedented. And yet so many people in that country can't turn on their lights. There's no electricity, there's no water. So, it goes back to this core idea of how dangerous corruption is, and how dangerous it is when we install institutions that are then flooded with money. And we have to look at the US role in that too, unfortunately.
Yeah. So you think this is potentially another US failure of nation building in the making?
I think we could all argue that about Iraq, till the days are end. But right now, the US just has no leverage there. So it's basically Iran and Iraq that are have to duel it out within that space. And at the end of the day, Iraqis have to decide what they want for their country, and whether they want their country to be controlled by another outsider, or if they want to take the reins back. And that is up to the Iraqi people. And we can just hope it's done in a way that doesn't lead to a broader escalation in conflict.
Yeah, there you go. Well, Muqtada al Sadr is certainly not done causing shockwaves in his own country, and we'll just have to watch and see. Well, thank you, Holly, for the update, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Thanks, Dennis.